Hello everybody, today I'm watching Truly Evil Human Experiments That Actually Happened by Chat History. Let's see what this is going to be.
Evil human experiments.
Human
Alright fellas, let's start
vivisections?
things off a little easy. Back in the 4th century BC, Greek civilization was reaching new heights. People were getting more and more
we're going really
curious
back
about
far
the
in
world
time for
around
this.
us and began asking really important questions. What does that do? How does that work? Should I
Philosophy.
leave the oven on? How do magnets work? She called me back. Is this real life? Or is this just fantasy? Really? The oven on? How do magnets
What did that one say?
Is this real life?
Where's my dad?
Does any really private rice or not? All pretty valid questions for people just wishing to learn the workings of the natural world. While many focus on the mechanics of the universe, others chose to focus on the inner workings of humans themselves, and not only from a philosophical standpoint. Sometimes you just want to know what makes us tick. That's what
What's
Greek
going on
physician
there?
Herophilus wanted to find out and document in detail. After getting his education at the Hippocratean medical school in Greece, Herophilus turned his bulging eyes towards the city of Alexandria, Egypt, with its big, throbbing library chock full of scrolls just begging to be read. Time to go to Egypt, he said, and so he did. Doot, doot, doot. After getting himself established and taking on a student, a young
When is this actually going to start the Truly Evil Human Experiments?
physician named Erasistratus, they got to work. Together, the two men would begin to carve out a new branch of science, anatomy. But in order to do so, you need some bodies to cut open to start slopping their guts around. And what better way to obtain fresh bodies than to use condemned criminals, captured and supplied by the Alexandrian rulers. Little Hero and Era were like kids in a...
I mean, let's be honest, they're criminals. Back in those days, most criminals, I'm pretty sure, were just killed one way or another. They were, what, hanged, tortured to death? So you might as well use them for something if you're gonna kill them anyway.
Candy store with a hopeful glimmer in their eyes, excited to begin
At least
their
they're not
wondrous
going to
experiment.
waste.
But surely the criminals put under the knife were already past their expiration date, right? Nope. Instead, Hero and Era performed live human dissections called vivisections to broaden their understanding of the human body. They even went as far
I mean, actually, no. I shouldn't feel bad for them. These people are criminals. They probably deserve... Actually, back then you could be easily framed. And you could be punished for the smallest and stupidest things, so maybe those people do deserve some sympathy. At least some of those people. I'm sure at least a good chunk of them were actually criminals.
To perform these surgeries in full view of the public for anyone who thought it would be cool.
I mean, that's pretty normal. That's how they used to kill people. When they executed them, they did it in public.
Herophilus documented their findings in extreme detail, making breakthrough discoveries of the human anatomy. In doing so, he inflicted unimaginable suffering to his subjects. Since anesthetics weren't really a thing back then, the victims felt every cut and slice, at least until they passed out from the pain or died of blood loss. Dissecting intestines, reproductive organs, eyes, or even purposefully damaging the motor nerves to inflict paralysis. It was basically a big game of, what does this button do? In the end, Hero and Era's findings over 40 years of vivisections were revolutionary for the medical world, especially since human dissection would be outlawed shortly after their work was completed. It wouldn't be until 1800 years later that performing human dissections would be a medically acceptable practice again. But like, you know, on dead people, their work was stored in the renowned Library of Alexandria.
Let's be honest. If those people were criminals, they probably deserve what happened to them. And the research they got was revolutionary. It's progress. It was progress for the human race, so I can't exactly condemn it. I would see no problem with experimenting on criminals, like, for example, murderers, rapists, you know, those type of people. I would not feel any sympathy for them. I would experiment on them. I feel like that's something that... If something like that was happening today, as in rapists and murderers and other similar crimes, you know... If people who committed them were being experimented on, I would not care. I would not feel sympathy for them because they probably deserve it. Unless they were framed. But just bad luck.
Alexandria, but they were lost in the Great Fire a few hundred years later.
So all of it was lost?
Project 4.1 was actually a side project proposed immediately after the deployment of Castle Bravo, a high-yield thermonuclear bomb that was dropped in 1954 by the United States. Bravo was part of Operation Castle, a series of other high-yield nuclear tests with the goal of establishing
Union Yankee Echo Nectar Romeo Coon.
with the goal of establishing superiority over the Soviet Union. The Marshall Islands, a remote Pacific group of islands, served as ground zero for.
Okay, so this is going to talk about just all the nuclear explosions that the US did in the Pacific, which were really terrible, caused a lot of damage, a lot of pollution. Maybe it's also going to talk about Bikini Atoll.
The detonation of the nuclear weapons. Castle Bravo was the strongest detonation, and surprisingly produced 2.5 times the expected explosive yield, resulting in an explosive force equivalent to 15 megatons of TNT.
I remember that correctly.
To put that into perspective, that is 1,000 times the explosive force of the nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima, Japan in the final days of World War II. Like, goddamn. To make matters worse, the Marshall Islands were occupied with citizens. So US officials were kind of like, sir, shouldn't we get those people out of the... Bless you.
Yeah, all those people probably have radiation poisoning already. Some of them might have even been cooked alive. And some of them might have had a perfectly cooked pizza. Because apparently that's a thing where there is a certain area, when a nuclear bomb explodes, there's a certain area where all the pizzas will be cooked perfectly. I wonder if that's actually like a thing that's possible, or if that's really just a joke, a myth.
Thanks, sir. Allergies have been bothering me all day.
Someone should try that. Just blow up a nuclear bomb.
No, but seriously, are we going to get those people out of
to cook a pizza?
Out of the radiation zone? Yeah, you know, that was on my to-do list. Well, too late now. Was on my to-do list.
Subscribe.
Well,
yeah, you should subscribe.
Too late now, so let's just see how things turn out. Operation Castle was quickly amended with the addition of Project 4.1. This new section aimed to study the human response to significant radiation exposure. You know, as if tens of thousands of victims in Hiroshima and Nagasaki weren't evidence enough. Commander of the U.S. Naval Medical Corps, Eugene Cronkite, was in charge of the project and swore everyone involved to absolute secrecy because he thought the public wouldn't be too keen on the whole test nuclear radiation on non-consenting people thing. Overall, 239 Marshallese residents were exposed to significant levels of radiation.
Only 239? That's actually not that bad. Let's be honest, 239 people, that's nothing. Compare that to how many died and got radiation poisoning in fucking Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Or, hell, I'm pretty sure Chernobyl probably caused more than that.
And began showing signs of radiation poisoning a few days later. Symptoms included loss of hair and significant skin damage with weeping wounds, although the wounds did heal rather quickly. Immediate observations ceased after 75 days with the conclusion that no long-term effects were likely. But just out of curiosity, Can you really tell there's not going to be any long-term effects after just slightly over 2 months? I don't think that's enough time. Checkups were performed on the residents for years after.
Oh, okay.
Women saw increases in miscarriages and stillbirths, and newborns that survived experienced developmental difficulties, impaired growth, and a disproportionate development of thyroid cancer. In addition, about 1/3 of those exposed had developed significant tumors by 1974, 20 years after Operation Castle commenced. In the following years, Marshallese representatives spoke out against
that's
the
where all
United
the waste
States,
is.
with accusations that the scope of the experiment was premeditated and intentional, to which the U.S. officials responded,
No.
Nuh-uh. During the early years of the Soviet Union...
Camera? This is the Polish word for camera. Interesting.
During the early years of the Soviet Union, it wouldn't be uncommon for political opponents to quickly fall ill with a strong case of the death at the hands of poison. In fact, it was quite an effective and discreet way to silence any and all opposition without causing too much of a stir. Well, besides the public reacting to mysterious deaths. And that is why we must rise up against... Oh, look at that. They got another one. So how were the Soviets so good at developing successful poisons? Well, you've got to run preliminary trials on living subjects, of course.
Oh,
so in
shit.
1921, a year before the Soviet Union officially formed, the Kamera was established. This was the Soviet Secret Service's poison laboratory. Here, new deadly poisons were developed and tested on human subjects. Those tested were prisoners from the gulags, various labor camps built around the country for
that's to be
anyone who even
expected.
had a fleeting thought that wasn't approved by the Soviet Union. Carry on. The ultimate goal of the Kamera was to devise a poison that was not.
Yeah, fun fact, I'm pretty sure Stalin caused more deaths than Hitler. Also, I think more people died in the Gulag than in the Nazi death camps. Let me fact check that real quick so I don't look like an idiot. Okay, so Stalin deliberately killed about 6 million people. You could bump that number up to 9 million if foreseeable deaths arising from policies are taken into account. Now let's check Hitler. Alright, whatever, I can't find just a simple number when it comes to Hitler, but let's just say 6 million, because that's how many people died in the death camps, and leave it at that. So yeah, Stalin killed pretty much just as many, if not more than Hitler. And yet some people celebrate him as if he's some sort of great person. Fucking retarded.
Only lethal, but undetectable. It would be colorless, tasteless, odorless, and untraceable in an autopsy. Prisoners would be unknowingly administered various test poisons, which were disguised as medication. For me, if it isn't an orange Flintstone vitamin, I don't trust it. The various poisons tested included ricin, which causes severe internal distress and suffering, cyanide, which can cause violent seizures and heart.
Another fun fact, cyanide is in apple seeds, and theoretically, if you eat enough apple seeds, you could die. Theoretically, you'd have to eat a shit ton of apple seeds to actually be able to die from it, because there's not that much cyanide in it. But it is possible, in theory.
And curare, a potent muscle relaxant that makes you painfully choke to death. In the end,
think about that while trying to eat an apple next time.
The tests were pretty successful. For the Soviet Union, not for the prisoners. Research led to innovative ways to discreetly dispatch a target, from deploying a cyanide mist to making an assassination look like a heart attack. But the blue ribbon winner was the...
Yeah, Russia does the same thing. People constantly falling out of buildings, ending up in freak accidents.
Concoction known as C2, carbolamine choline chloride, which was basically liquid depression. Exposure to this sucker sparked a very curious reaction. Instead of a violent telltale "I've been poisoned" type death, the victim would simply become weak with a rapid decline in health, all while maintaining a calm and silent demeanor. Death occurred within 15 minutes. Since the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russian officials have claimed that the Kamera has been disestablished and abandoned. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, no. Definitely not.
Now, you may have heard
syphilis. Isn't syphilis an STD?
About the Tuskegee syphilis study, which was an unethical medical study funded by the United States Public Health Service in 1932, which involved the study of nearly 400 African American men who had naturally contracted syphilis. The goal was to observe the effects of the disease when left untreated in African American males. Even though penicillin, an antibiotic cure for syphilis, eventually became widely available to the public, the afflicted men were intentionally never cured.
I think I might have heard of this one before.
Well, the U.S. decided to outdo themselves with the Guatemalan syphilis experiment. In 1946 to 1948, more than 5,500 Guatemalan natives, including children, were involved in the experiment against their will, with the Guatemalan government granting access to the unwilling patients in hospitals, mental institutions, and even orphanages. Around 1,300.
So the Guatemalan government wanted to get rid of the people who were problematic for them. Those who were deemed as useless.
100 relatively healthy individuals ages 10 to 72 were intentionally infected with syphilis and even gonorrhea.
I mean, from a government standpoint, I can understand it, because if those people were in like mental hospitals, orphanages, you know, stuff like that, they were not as they were probably not as productive as other people. So from a government standpoint, I can actually see why they would try to get rid of them. But from a humanitarian standpoint, this is fucking disgusting.
Transmission was either done by direct bacterial contact into wounds or by sexual transmission with infected native sex workers, which were funded by the US government, by the way. The latter of which proved to be a very effective method of infection. The guy in charge of these experiments was Dr. John C. Cutler, but you can call him Dr. Dickass. He often failed to keep accurate medical records of his experiments and instead would only provide anecdotal evidence in his findings, probably because he knew what he was doing was unethical, which very much sounds like something only a dickass would do.
Yeah,
but all joking
probably
aside, the experiments conducted on these people were gruesome. Perhaps one of the most notable documented examples of what these people experienced was about a female patient named Berta. The following is an excerpt from that document. Berta was a female patient in the psychiatric hospital. In February 1948, Berta was injected in her left arm with syphilis. A month later, she developed scabies. Several weeks later, Dr. Cutler noted that she had also developed red bumps where he had injected her arm, lesions on her arms and legs, and her skin was beginning to waste away from her body. Berta was not treated for syphilis until 3 months after her injection. Soon after, on August 23rd, Dr. Cutler wrote that Berta appeared as if she was going to die, but he did not specify why. That same day, he put gonorrheal pus from another male subject into both of Berta's eyes, as well as her private areas. He also reinfected her with syphilis. Several days later, Berta's eyes were filled with pus from the gonorrhea, and she was bleeding from her private area. 3 days later, on August 27th, Berta died.
What was the point?
He was a dick ass. The overall goal of the study was to determine the effectiveness of penicillin in preventing the STDs. Dr. Cutler had allegedly finalized his reports in 1955, but no evidence was ever found proving that the reports were submitted for peer review or even published. So,
no shit.
Out of all of that suffering, nothing of medical value was produced. Though I will say in
at least with some of the previous ones, you know, like the very first one, the vivisections, at least those actually provided something. They revolutionized medicine in ancient times. This did nothing. This was just torture.
Of fairness, a treatment program was established by the United States and made available to the affected Guatemalan population, but only half were reported to actually have received treatments with a questionable quality of care. United States President Barack Obama.
The only reason they actually did the treatment program was for PR, so that they wouldn't be blamed as much for it.
Formally apologized to the Guatemalan government in 2010, 62 years after the study was performed. Yeah, that last one was quite
Unit
the
731?
doozy, huh? Well, buckle up because it's about to get way worse. See this right here? This is Unit 731. It was home to some of the most notorious and truly evil war crimes committed by the Japanese in World War II, which are definitely up there with some of the worst in the history of mankind. Unit 731 served
since this is Japan in China, I'm assuming it's going to be similar to what happened in Nanking.
Served as a lethal human experimentation and biological weapons laboratory during the Second Sino-Japanese War between China and Japan, which ran concurrent to most of the events of World War II. This nightmare facility was established in 1935 in the sub-provincial Chinese city of Harbin, 4 years after Japanese forces invaded the Chinese region of Manchuria. Inside, hundreds of thousands of Chinese and even some Russian prisoners of war were subjected to some of the most egregious and horrifying human experimentations known to man. Experiments performed on men, women, and children, which is everyone. Those chosen for experimentation were dehumanized and referred to as maruta, or logs, rather than as people, because the cover-up story for Unit 731 was that it was a lumber mill. It should be noted that the vast majority of the experiments in the facility were carried out to fulfill morbid curiosity, with those performing or overseeing the studies described as merely playing. A testimony from a Japanese professor.
So they're not even trying to get anything out of this. They're just doing it for the hell of it. This has no purpose whatsoever.
who witnessed the studies, was quoted saying that some of the experiments had nothing to do with advancing the capability of germ warfare or of medicine. There is such a thing as professional curiosity. What would happen if we did such and such? What medical purpose was served by performing and studying beheadings? None at all. That was just playing around.
Technically, you could have some medical purpose studied by beheading, because I've heard that if you get beheaded, your brain technically survives for like a few seconds. I'm not sure where I read it, but I think it was some sort of French study, like a really old study where when they cut off people's heads, they checked if they were still conscious. And I think one guy was still like conscious for 10 seconds and could look up even though his head was beheaded. I'm not sure if that's actually true or if it's just a lie, but I've read about it.
Around. Professional people, too, like to play. So basically experiments were like, I wonder what would happen if we just hucked a grenade at a guy.
You know, these days we have video games for this type of stuff. The people who complain about video games breeding violence, it's like, you seeing this shit? This is what people used to do 70 years ago before we had video games. Now we do this type of stuff online. We don't have to do it in real life anymore.
Bang. Oh look, he exploded. Hey, can I go home now? Gee, I wonder if this large heavy object will crush this guy. Yup. Will this guy freeze to death if I freeze him to death?
Yup.
Wow, who would have guessed? A lot of these experiments were designed to test the absolute limits of the human body. Tests included depriving victims of food or water to see how long they could survive,
Few
placing
days
victims in low-pressure
without
chambers
water
until their eyes popped from their skulls, injecting victims with animal blood, hanging victims upside down until death.
Injecting humans with animal blood, that's how diseases start. Like fucking rabies, AIDS, you know. Pretty much any disease an animal carries could be carried by the human if you get their blood.
Or even draining victims of blood just to study blood loss limits. Some victims were even dehydrated in front of large hot fans to the point of mummification. At the time of death, they only weighed 20% of their initial body weight. Perhaps one of the worst examples I've read was the forced pregnancy of female victims. The mothers were injected with various diseases and drugs just to see how they affected the unborn child, sometimes performing a vivisection, cutting the fetus out of the mother for examination. There's honestly so many more gruesome experiments that I just can't get into here, so if you are curious, I would encourage you to look them up. But it's like legit really bad, so you've been warned. By the end of the war, as Soviet forces were closing,
I'm quite desensitized to pretty much everything, so I'll watch a video about Unit 731. I'll make a reaction to it.
Japanese officials had all remaining prisoners executed and the entirety of Unit 731 hastily demolished to destroy any remaining evidence of the program's existence. The United States had discovered trace evidence and pressured Japanese officials into spilling the beans, under threat that they would be handed over to Soviet officials for trial and punishment if they did not cooperate. Once the US learned the full extent of the horrors of Unit 731, all of those involved were swiftly brought to trial and executed for their crimes. Except, no, they actually weren't. In reality, the United States claimed that the data collected from the inhumane atrocities was actually pretty valuable, since it is otherwise ethically unobtainable through conventional means.
That is kind of true. You can't get this stuff legally because it's inhumane. So I could see why they would think there's value in it, because there most likely is actually value in it. Fuck.
As such, many of
if I was in the US, I would take all that research for myself because it is valuable, and I would still execute them because it's fucked up what they did.
Those involved were granted immunity and
I would just be like, thank you, you can die now.
Freedom in exchange for the data. The deal was struck, and the United States kept everything under lock and key. The Soviet Union, however, pursued trials against the top military leaders and scientists from Unit 731. In the end, only 12 individuals were tried and sentenced to several years in labor camps, although the United States repeatedly denied that Unit 731 ever existed. Well, that was a bummer. Here's something to cheer you up.
So yeah, the US was basically just trying to cover up Unit 731, similar to how the Russians are trying to cover up the... That was a good video. Very interesting. A lot of really fucked up shit. That's the only way to really put what happened and what they did to innocent people. Well, okay, maybe not all of them. There were some of these experiments were conducted on like prisoners and shit. Like the first one, the vivisections. So that's not that bad. Humans, the type of stuff we can do and think of is... to put it simply, some corners of the human mind are better left unexplored. Some of those thoughts and questions should probably be left unanswered. But unfortunately that didn't happen and didn't work for those people. So yeah, like, subscribe, comment. The link to my Discord server is down in the description below, so you can check that out if you want. And I will see you in the next video, which will probably be about Unit 731.